Hello, my name is Phil and welcome to Theology Explored. What we're going to be doing in this video is exploring the tools that we need to properly get into understanding theology. But before we get there, what actually is theology? Theos means God in the Greek, and logos means words about. It means the way we think about things. So literally it means words about God or ways of thinking about God. Over time, it originally meant predominantly the Christian God, Christian theology, but that becomes problematic when we're talking about a religion that came about in a polytheistic world, and there's a whole bunch of influences that go on there. And obviously in the modern world we're also dealing with theology applying to all sorts of different religions, but for the purposes of this video we're going to be looking predominantly at Christian theology. So theology itself is a big, complex idea. It's not just talking about God, but we need to interact with archaeology, with sociology, in a whole bunch of other tools. There's literature criticism in there, there's historic criticism in there, there's ancient forms of understanding and transmission, and all these things kind of come together to form theology. So let me try and explain how that works. By and large, if you take a concept, a theological concept, let's take, for example, God as a paper cup and put it at the top of a paper cup pyramid. If you think, okay, this is what I know about God, if you take that paper cup off and try to understand it more, underneath you'll find two more paper cups that explain a bit more about God and about what you know about it. As you begin to explore what each of these paper cups means, underneath you're going to find three more paper cups. And if you take those three off, you're going to find four, and so on and so on. And a lot of these theological concepts have these layers and layers and layers of deeper understanding, intertwined deeper understanding, that goes all the way back to as far as our written record goes, and back into prehistory, where we actually need to look at tools like archaeology and ancient history to actually try and understand what it was the people believed at the time. So that's our pyramid, our paper cup pyramid. So how do we go about doing that? Well, to actually start building our ideas, what we're going to need is some tools. Now, the prime tool that we're going to start with is going to be what Richard Hooker outlined. Now, Richard Hooker lived in 1554 to 1600, and he was one of the mainstays of the Reformation in the United Kingdom. Now, or at least later writers standing on his work, came up with the idea of a three-legged stool. That means that all theology needs to have all three of these stools in order to be considered to be stable. Any one leg missing and it will fall over. So those three legs are Scripture, reason, and tradition. Scripture, reason, and tradition. Some later thinkers have also wanted to add experience as a fourth leg of the stool, but we will come to that later in this video. So the first leg, quite obviously, is going to be Scripture. Scripture here meaning the collected written words that make up the Bible, the canon, that is those books that the church have decided are the ones that are most important, as well as some other texts that revolve around them. But when we think of Scripture, generally we think of the Bible. And for this video, and for all of the videos in this series, we're going to be using a translation called the NRSV. Now, the NRSV is the translation that's used in a lot of scholarly work, and we will come to why that is in a later video. But for now, whenever you want to look up any of the quotes that we use, it's going to be coming out of the NRSV. Now, you're mostly used to the Bible like that, but we're also going to be looking at the Apocrypha. Now, this is a collection of books that were originally in the Bible, but were taken out during the Reformation for a whole bunch of different reasons. But we're also going to be looking at the Apocrypha, but probably in a much, much later video. So the Bible itself is not a book like we're used to. Bible coming from biblios, meaning collection of books. So these collection of books span probably about 1200 from 1200 BCE right the way down to 400 CE. So that's a big swathe of time for these books. But also, these books, well, apart from the New Testament, we'll come to the New Testament and sort of stands on its own. But the Old Testament certainly was, the books themselves began as a collection of stories, a collection of ideas that were gathered together over time. So you'll have some stories maybe originally being written, say, in 1200, and then maybe in the 800s or the 700s BCE, people would come along and they would take these stories and edit them and add a gloss to them and pull them together into a book. And this was just a process that was done throughout the ancient Near East. It's not weird. It's weird to us because we're used to the idea of a book being something that somebody sat down, wrote from start to finish, and then nobody touched. That was it. That was the completed work. That wasn't how it was in the ancient Near East. So that's our Bible. It's a collection of books pulled together over a very long period, probably by different authors, sometimes different authors even in the same book. Clearly, we're going to need a whole new video just to look at that issue, but just for now, hold on to the idea that one of our legs of our stools is Scripture. Our second, of course, is reason. This is our ability to think. And its initial reason for being included comes as a bit of a circular idea. You see, from the perspective of theology, God gave people the ability to think, and therefore we should use our ability to think to understand God. The Bible itself says that actually we should be looking after wisdom, seeking after wisdom. It's all the way through the wisdom literature, through the prophets, and so on. And so using our ability to think is vitally important. Now, we've also got to take into account some of the greatest thinkers. So St. Augustine said, when science and scripture are at odds, by and large we should take science to be true, and we should find a way in which scripture tells the deeper truth, as he put it. Now, bearing in mind he's talking about science as was understood in the 400s, but his idea still rings true, that science and theology have this rather interactive nature. They're not at war, as some people would want us to believe. And it wasn't just St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was writing on Augustine, said, "In discussing questions of this kind, two rules are to be observed. As Augustine teaches, the first is to hold the truth of Scripture without wavering. The second is that since Holy Scripture can be explained in a multiplicity of senses, one should adhere to a particular explanation only in such measure as to be ready to abandon it if it be proved with certainty to be false, lest the Holy Scripture be exposed to the ridicule of unbelievers and obstacles be placed in their believing." So that's where we're starting. This is why we need to bring our reason to our theology. We've got the Bible, we've got our reason, and these two together begin to form the three legs of our stool. And that's not just where we stand. A two-legged stool is probably going to fall over. I'm sure you can find videos of the internet where that's not the case. But following Richard Hooker, we're going to look now at our third stool, which is tradition. Now, tradition, we're used to the idea of tradition as being this static, unmoving thing that once something becomes a tradition, it can never be changed. It is sacrosanct. But that's not how tradition is understood. We're used to tradition being like the cat that was brought in for the altar. Let me just tell you this little story. So, a while ago, there was a church in the rural country which was plagued by mice. And whenever the bread was brought out for the service, the mice would swarm the altar and run off with the bread. That makes doing the service very difficult. So they decided, rather sensibly, that they're going to get a cat. So at the point where the bread would be placed on the altar, the cat would be brought in and it would chase the mice away. And over time, everything was groovy, everything was relaxed. And over time, as the cat got old, he was still brought in and placed under the altar because the mice had learned not to come in when the cat was there. Now, over time, the cat sadly passed away, and the congregation thought, I know what we'll do, is we'll stuff the cat. And rather than putting it on a little display case and saying, dear Tiddles, thank you for your service, they continued to bring the cat in on this plush velvet cushion and place it under the altar. Now, over time, and we're talking generations, people moved on and people forgot why it was they brought in the cat, and yet the cat was still brought in. Until one day you get a young priest who is about to start the service, and in comes Tiddles, stuffed and on his cushion, and the person at his elbow says, you can't start the service until Tiddles arrives. And the priest says, what on earth is this? What's going on? And I said, why do we bring in the cat? And people said, look, we don't know. We just always have. That's an example of a dead tradition. It's not performing its function as it was originally designed to. It's not really helping the people in any way. It doesn't get us a way of helping and getting to know God in any way. So that's a dead tradition. Tradition, as outlined by Richard Hooker, is a living thing. And it's sort of a long conversation, perhaps a debate between order, which is the tendency for everything to want to be the same as it always was and never changing, and prophecy, which is the idea that's calling people to new things and new understandings. And these two in tension slowly bring theology to sort of somewhere in the middle, but always a new thing, always moving forward. Let me see if I can give you an example of that. During the Reformations, during the Industrial Revolution, just after the Reformations, you had this idea that people were being moved to cities. So they would go for the coal mining, they would go for the textile industry and so on. They would leave their home places. And it meant that the churches ended up quite far away from the people. And you can still see this in some of the geography in the UK, where you've got churches that were built on the hill, which initially would have had the village around it. But over time, the village has moved away, sometimes miles away, as roads and rail has dragged the village further and further away from the church. Now, the Church of England, as it was at the time, absolutely refused to change. If people wanted to come to the church, they could come to the church, the same as they had done for generations and generations. The Methodist preachers, though they didn't really mean to break away from the church, that was kind of an accident, but we'll talk about that later. They said, look, we absolutely need to take God to these people. So they went and preached in fields and in pubs and in all the places where people gathered, and people would come out and listen to them. And this began this great new movement which led to Methodism. Now, over time, this idea that the church should be where the people are had a big effect on the Church of England and later the Church of Wales. And slowly the way in which churches were built changed. Whenever a population centre moves away, now the Church of England and the Church of Wales tries to respond to that by being where the people are. So, but even though, and you've still kind of got that order which says, actually, we're not going to preach in a field, we're going to find a building or a community centre and preach in there. But the two ideas have sort of moved so that they're much closer together than they were when they whole started. So that's prophecy and order, and it's those two together that produce this idea of a living tradition, a tradition that gives and grows and grows. So as I said at the beginning, so that's our three main stools. That's scripture, reason and tradition. If I said at the beginning that some people would want to add a fourth stool, and this fourth stool is that of experience. So this is predominantly a Methodist theology, but this about recalls your own experience and what its bearing is on theology. Now, I think actually somebody's own experience of God and their own experience of God working in their life is a very valuable and useful thing that we can add to theology. And I can see why some people would want to make it a leg in its own right. But I'm very cautious about that idea, following a bit of theology that comes out what began as an insult by a gentleman called George Tyrrell. The problem with leaning on our own experience and kind of trying to privilege it, while it should have a weight, but trying to privilege it, leads us to the problem of actually looking down a well and seeing Jesus's face staring back at us. Now, what we're seeing at the bottom of that well is not actually Jesus's face, but our own. So our theology then isn't then about Jesus, but more about trying to put what we want Jesus to be onto Jesus. And privileging experience can actually lead to that kind of thing. And we can see a lot of that in some modern charismatic evangelical churches, where actually the experience trumps the whole idea of thinking about about theology, of coming to understand theology and wanting to do any kind of reason or experience or exploring with that. They just focused on their own experience. And that can lead us to some very awkward places. Out of this same kind of privileging idea of experience, we've also got the idea of sola scriptura, by scripture alone. Now, this comes out of a gentleman called Martin Luther, and Martin Luther, again, we're writing in the Reformations, but and it means by scripture alone. That actually we don't need the traditions. Martin Luther, in this particular case, we're talking about the Catholic traditions that had a big argument, and we'll probably cover that. He's very important in that way. They had a big argument, and he was sort of saying, look, by the Bible alone, we should build our theology. But Martin Luther himself didn't actually want to just sort of say, it's only about the Bible and ignore all these other things that we've been talking about. What he meant was that when you kind of read the Bible in a group, what the Bible has to say to that group at that point in that time is what the Bible has to say at that point in that time to that group of people. And it may say something different to different people in different places, and that's okay. But of course, that hasn't been how that's worked out in the modern world. So sola scriptura now has become this kind of biblical, literal only form of theology, which wasn't where it began in the beginning. I would put experience as being a part of reason, because we are reasoned, rationed, thinking people, and we can't really very easily separate our own emotions and the people we are from what we're writing. And we should actually be aware of that as we're writing and as we're doing theology, that we have a particular understanding, that our life experience has coloured that writing and understanding. And we should, with the help of the other pillars and with other people in our wider circle, temper that idea and try to come to a conversation. And it is from that long, hard work that we come up with theology, with words about God. Okay, so I think that's all we're going to cover in this video, and I hope you found it useful, and I hope that you have found it helpful. Just remember that theology then is about bringing all of these elements together, bringing them all together into one big pot, putting them all together and coming up with ideas and interacting with the whole breadth and depth of theologies we've got going on now, as well as all the stuff that's happened over time. So theology is a big ball, and we're going to attempt over the next few videos to delve into that. So thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have enjoyed this, please give a thumbs up, like and subscribe to the video. Remember, all of the reference that I've used in this video will be down in the comments below, so please do check them out. And of course, please like and subscribe to this channel for more videos. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for watching. Remember, I've been Phil, you've been awesome, and have a phenomenal and blessed rest of whatever it is you're doing. Bye-bye.